Every day a poor waitress pays for a customer's lunch, unaware that he's a billionaire in disguise, and destiny brings them together in a touching love story. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Helen adjusted her apron, glancing at the clock mounted above the counter of Charlie's diner. The hands crept towards 6 p.m., marking the end of another long shift. At 58, Helen's body often felt the grind of double shifts, her feet aching and her hands calloused. Yet the fatigue wasn't what weighed her down. It was the silence of her small house at the edge of town, a home that had once echoed with laughter and the familiar melody of her husband's piano. Frank had been gone for 3 years now, but the void he left seemed to deepen with each passing day. Her mind flicked to the stack of bills piled on the kitchen table, mortgage payments, utilities, and the costs of running her free music school. A dream she and Frank had built together threatened to drown her. Despite the burden, Helen refused to let go of the school. It was her connection to Frank, to their shared belief that music could change lives. Every note played by her students felt like a whisper from him, urging her to keep going. The bell over the diner's door jingled, snapping her back to the present. An elderly man shuffled in, his clothes neat but worn. He chose a corner booth, his gaze fixed on the laminated menu, though he seemed to already know what he wanted. Helen had noticed him before. He came in twice a week, always ordered the same grilled cheese sandwich with tomato soup, and lingered as though savoring more than just the food. Helen approached, her pen poised. "The usual today?" she asked with a warm smile. The man nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, please." There was a fragility to him that tugged at her heart. She had seen it in Frank in his last days. A kind of quiet resignation. It wasn't just the physical frailty, it was the loneliness that clung to him like a shadow. As she brought the man his meal, Helen noticed his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the spoon. Without thinking, she made a decision. When his check came, she slipped her own card through the register, covering his bill. He looked up in surprise when she told him, her tone light and casual, "It's on the house today." A faint smile crossed his lips, the kind that reached his eyes, and he murmured a soft "thank you." Helen felt a small warmth bloom in her chest. For a moment, it was as though the world's weight lifted. Later, as she tidied his table after he left, Helen's thoughts returned to her daughter, Martha. They hadn't spoken in weeks, their last conversation ending in an argument. Martha had always disapproved of Helen's sacrifices for the music school, calling her altruism, naive, and reckless. "You're giving everything to strangers and leaving nothing for yourself or your family," Martha had said, her tone sharp with frustration. Helen often wondered if her daughter resented her for being too focused on others and not enough on her, but Martha didn't see what Helen saw. When the children at the music school mastered their first song or beamed after performing for their parents, it filled a void that loneliness and grief couldn't. She clung to those moments, even as her resources dwindled. The bell jingled again as the diner's last customers filtered out, and Helen began closing up. She glanced at the booth where the elderly man had sat. On the table, where his soup had been, lay a folded napkin. Curious, she picked it up. Inside was a message scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists." Helen's heart skipped. The words felt like a balm on a wound she hadn't realized needed healing. She tucked the note into her apron pocket, her lips curving into a soft smile. Perhaps small acts of kindness didn't erase loneliness or debt, but they added something intangible yet vital: hope. Unbeknownst to Helen, the man, Richard Maxwell, stepped into his car, parked a block away. The sleek vehicle stood in stark contrast to his humble attire, Adjusting the rearview mirror, he allowed himself a rare smile. For months, Richard had wandered from one small town to another, seeking authenticity in a world he no longer trusted. His wealth had brought him everything except the answers he craved. Were people good without expectation? Did kindness come with a price? Tonight, a waitress with tired eyes and a warm smile had given him a glimpse of something he hadn't felt in years: belief in humanity. As the diner's lights dimmed behind him, Richard made a mental note to return. There was something about Helen that intrigued him, something genuine and unpolished that stirred a curiosity he couldn't ignore. For now, he drove off into the quiet night, unaware of the ripples their brief interaction would create in both their lives. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Helen's modest kitchen as she sipped her coffee, her thoughts lingering on the elderly man from the diner. His quiet gratitude and the note he had left stayed with her, like a melody she couldn't shake. It had been such a small gesture, paying for his meal, but the impact it seemed to have on him made her wonder if kindness really could make a difference in the world. Helen rinsed her cup and prepared for the day. Saturdays were reserved for her music school, a small, cluttered space tucked behind the church. The children were waiting, eager to practice for an upcoming recital. Each of them carried their own struggles: absent parents, financial hardships, or the weight of being overlooked. She saw herself in their eyes, in their longing to be seen and heard. Arriving at the school, Helen found her star pupil, Lily, tuning an old violin. At 12, Lily had an instinct for music that was rare and beautiful. She played with her heart, her bow pulling emotions from the strings that left even Helen in awe. As Lily practiced, Helen felt a pang of bittersweet pride. She wished Frank were here to witness it. He would have called it a miracle. By the afternoon, Helen was back at the diner, slipping into the rhythm of her second shift. The clatter of plates and hum of conversation filled the air, but her mind drifted to Martha. It had been over a month since they'd spoken, and the silence between them gnawed at her. Helen knew she should call her daughter, but the words always caught in her throat. Martha's disapproval, her sharp tone, they felt like walls Helen couldn't climb. The door jingled, pulling Helen from her thoughts. It was the same man from yesterday. He walked in with the same slow shuffle and took his usual booth. His presence surprised her. Most customers didn't frequent the diner 2 days in a row. As Helen approached, his eyes met hers briefly, and this time there was a flicker of recognition. "Grilled cheese and tomato soup?" she asked, already writing it down. He nodded, but there was a slight hesitation. "Yes, thank you," he said, his voice soft, almost careful. As the order was prepared, Helen found herself glancing toward him more often than usual. Something about him was different today. He sat with a stillness that felt deliberate, as though he were trying to blend into the surroundings. Yet, there was a quiet attentiveness in the way he folded his hands on the table, his gaze occasionally sweeping the room. When she brought him his meal, he looked up. "You're Helen, aren't you?" he asked, her brow furrowed in surprise. "Yes, but how do you know that? You wore a name tag yesterday," he replied, a faint smile breaking the lines of his face. "I'm Richard. It's nice to officially meet you, Richard," she said, her curiosity piqued. Throughout his meal, Richard seemed more present. When Helen refilled his coffee, he thanked her with a warmth that felt personal. It was a subtle shift, but Helen noticed. He lingered longer after his meal, his hands clasped around his mug as though savoring the moment. As the day wore on, Helen found herself wondering about him. What brought him here? He didn't seem like the type to live in their small town, and yet he moved as though he belonged. There was something enigmatic about him, a sense of depth she couldn't quite place. By the time Richard left, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. He stopped at the counter, paid his bill, and left a tip larger than usual. As he stepped out, Helen noticed he glanced back, just briefly, before disappearing into the evening. That night, Helen sat in her living room, the silence of her house pressing against her. She opened the drawer of the side table and pulled out the note Richard had left the day before. Reading it again, she felt a warmth spread through her. It was rare for someone to see her, really see her, beyond her role as a waitress or the widow clinging to a dream. For the first time in a long while, she felt appreciated. Unbeknownst to her, Richard had returned to the diner parking lot, seated in his car. He watched the glow of the lights inside and thought of Helen. She intrigued him, her quiet strength and kindness sparking a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. For a man who had spent decades surrounded by luxury and pretense, her authenticity was a revelation. Richard had come to this town searching for something. He wasn't entirely sure what. But Helen, with her worn hands and gentle smile, seemed to embody it. He resolved to return, to learn more about her. There was something in her simplicity, her unassuming grace, that made him feel human. For Helen, the day ended as it often did, with her at the piano. The keys were slightly out of tune, but the familiar notes filled the room. As she played, she thought of Frank, of Martha, and, surprisingly, of Richard, a stranger who had quietly stepped into her world and, in just 2 days, left her questioning the rhythms of her routine. Helen stared at the calendar hanging in her kitchen, the days marked off with neat red X's. The due date for the mortgage payment loomed at the end of the week, and her bank account was dangerously low. She sighed, folding the notice and tucking it into a drawer already cluttered with similar papers. As much as she tried to stretch her income, the bills kept piling up. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Martha. Helen hesitated before answering, bracing herself for the usual lecture. "Hi, Mum," Martha said, her tone clipped. "Hi, sweetheart," Helen replied, trying to sound cheerful. "I was just calling to see if you're still spending money on the music school," Martha began without preamble. "You know you can't afford it, right? You're barely keeping the house." Helen tightened her grip on the phone. "The school is important, Martha. Those kids aren't your responsibility," Martha interrupted. "Your responsibility is to yourself. You're running yourself into the ground." "Martha, Mom!" Martha cut her off again, her voice softening slightly. "I'm saying this because I care. You don't have to save everyone." The line went quiet for a moment, and Helen took a steadying breath. "I'll think about it," she said, though they both knew she wouldn't. The call ended shortly after D, leaving Helen with the familiar ache of their unresolved tension. That evening, at the diner, Helen noticed Richard sitting in his usual booth. He was early today, his head bent over a book as he sipped his coffee. She hesitated before approaching him, the weight of her financial worries making her wonder if she could afford to keep paying for his meals. It wasn't much, but even small acts of kindness carried a cost, and hers was adding up. "Good evening, Richard," she greeted as she reached his table. "The usual." "Yes, thank you, Helen," he replied, looking up with a smile that seemed more genuine with each passing day. As she walked away to place his order, Helen's thoughts swirled. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that her small gestures, while meaningful, might be reckless. What if Martha was right? What if her sacrifices were in vain? When the bill came, Helen found herself hesitating. The idea of covering it again felt daunting. She had to think about herself, her home, her school. Yet, as she glanced at Richard, who was carefully folding a napkin into precise creases, she remembered the note he'd left. The simple gratitude in those words had touched her in a way she hadn't expected. With a resigned sigh, Helen slipped her card through the register. She placed the receipt on Richard's table without a word, retreating to the counter to busy herself with wiping down menus. As the evening wore on, Helen noticed Richard watching her more than usual. It wasn't intrusive, but his gaze held a curiosity she couldn't ignore. When he finished his meal and stood to leave, he paused at the counter. "Thank you, Helen," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not just for today, for everything." She blinked, caught off guard. "You're welcome," she replied, her words barely above a whisper. After Richard left, Helen sat at the counter, her mind racing. What was it about this man that made her question her instincts? She had always believed in the power of kindness, yet now doubts crept in. Was she being naive? Was Martha right? The next day, Helen arrived at the music school to find Lily waiting on the steps, her violin case in hand. The girl's face lit up when she saw Helen, and for a moment, the shadows of doubt receded. "Miss Helen," Lily began, "do you think we'll ever be able to get new instruments? Some of the kids' violins don't even stay in tune anymore." Helen forced a smile. "We'll find a way, Lily. We always do." But as she led the children through their practice, Helen couldn't help but feel the weight of Lily's words. The school needed more than she could give, and the realization was crushing. By the end of the day, her doubts had grown, gnawing at her resolve. That evening at the diner, Helen debated whether to continue her quiet generosity toward Richard. She resolved to make a decision soon, but as she approached his table with his usual meal, he looked up at her with such warmth and sincerity that her resolve wavered. "Do you ever play anymore?" he asked suddenly. Helen blinked, startled. "Play what?" "Music," he said. "You strike me as someone who loves music." "I used to," she admitted, her voice tinged with wistfulness. "Not much time for it these days." "You should," he said, his tone almost reverent. "The world could use more beauty like that." Helen felt her cheeks flush, an unusual sensation. She nodded, murmuring a polite response before retreating to the kitchen. As she busied herself with work, Richard's words lingered, intertwining with her doubts and fears. By the end of the night, as Helen locked up the diner, she stood for a moment under the streetlights, staring at the empty street. The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered. Should she continue her quiet acts of kindness? Could she afford to? Or was it time to face the reality that not everyone could be saved, not even herself? Helen awoke to the soft patter of rain against her bedroom window. The grey light filtering in seemed to echo the heaviness in her chest. Her conversation with Martha replayed in her mind like a broken record. Martha's words, though harsh, lingered with an unsettling truth. Helen's life was a delicate balance, one where every act of kindness seemed to tip the scales further into uncertainty. She shuffled into the kitchen, her slippers scuffing against the linoleum floor. As she prepared her coffee, her gaze drifted to the piano in the corner of the living room. Dust had begun to gather along its edges, a silent testament to how long it had been since she last played. Helen ran her fingers along the keys, pressing one gently. A single note filled the room, a sound both comforting and haunting. By the time she arrived at the music school, the rain had turned to a steady drizzle. The children were already gathered, their chatter filling the small space with energy. Lily was in her usual spot, her violin tucked under her arm, her face alight with enthusiasm. "Miss Helen," Lily called as she approached, "I've been practicing the piece for the recital. Do you want to hear?" Helen smiled, her earlier gloom momentarily lifting. "Of course, Lily, let's hear it." Lily began to play, her bow gliding over the strings with a grace that belied her young age. The melody was sweet and melancholy, and as Helen listened, she felt a lump rise in her throat. It was moments like these that reminded her why she kept going, why she pushed past the exhaustion and financial strain. Yet, as the last note faded, another thought crept in. How much longer could she sustain this? The children dispersed for lunch, leaving Helen alone in the quiet room. She sat on the edge of a desk, her hands clasped tightly, as one of the younger students, Ethan, lingered behind. He was a shy boy, always hanging back, but today he seemed braver. "Miss Helen," Ethan began, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you ever need help? Like we do?" The question startled her. Helen looked at him, her chest tightening. "What makes you ask that, Ethan?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the scuffed floor. "You just always help us, but no one helps you. I think you might need it too." Helen was struck by the simplicity of his words. Out of the mouths of children often came the most profound truths. She ruffled his hair gently and sent him on his way, but his questions stayed with her long after he left. Later that evening at the diner, Helen's thoughts were heavy. Richard arrived, as usual, taking his seat in the corner booth. He seemed different tonight, though she couldn't put her finger on why. There was a restlessness about him, a subtle shift in his demeanor. As she set his plate down, he looked up at her, his eyes searching. "You seem tired," he said, his voice tinged with concern. Helen gave a faint smile. "Long day," she replied. "Nothing I can't handle." "You handle a lot," he said, his gaze steady. "More than most, I'd wager." Helen didn't know how to respond. She busied herself with wiping down the table next to his, but his words lingered. How could this man, who knew so little about her, see through the carefully constructed facade she wore every day? As Richard ate, Helen found herself watching him from behind the counter. She wondered again about his story. He didn't seem like the kind of man who needed kindness, yet he accepted it with such quiet humility. There was a mystery to him, one that stirred her curiosity and unease in equal measure. When the diner emptied out, Richard lingered. He folded his napkin carefully, as he always did, and left his payment on the table. This time, though, there was something else, a folded note. After he left, Helen approached his table, her heart quickening. She unfolded the paper and read the handwritten words. "Kindness isn't weakness. It's strength disguised. Don't doubt yourself." The note felt like a lifeline, a small beacon in the fog of her doubt. She tucked it into her apron pocket, her fingers lingering over the paper as if holding on to the reassurance it offered. That night, as Helen sat at the piano, she played a melody she hadn't touched in years. The notes were hesitant at first, but they soon flowed with a familiarity that brought tears to her eyes. She thought of Frank, of Martha, of the children at the music school, and she thought of Richard, whose quiet presence had somehow managed to steady her when her resolve had begun to falter. In the quiet of her living room, Helen made a decision. She didn't have all the answers, and the future was as uncertain as ever, but she knew this. She couldn't let go of the kindness that defined her, even if it came at a cost. It was who she was, and for now, that was enough. Helen stood in her kitchen the following morning, her coffee steaming in the mug she'd had since her 20s. The rain from the previous day had cleared, leaving the air crisp and invigorating. But her mind wasn't on the weather. It circled around Richard's note, tucked safely into her apron pocket. The words felt both a challenge and a reassurance, pushing her to reflect on the strength she doubted she possessed. By mid-afternoon, Helen found herself at the diner, slipping into the well-worn rhythm of her shift. The clang of plates and murmur of customers formed a familiar backdrop, but her mind wandered to the stack of unpaid bills at home. Despite her resolve the previous evening, the weight of her circumstances felt heavier than ever. The bell above the door jingled, drawing her attention. Richard entered, his presence now so familiar that it no longer startled her. He moved to his usual booth, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. Helen approached, her order pad in hand. "Grilled cheese and tomato soup," she asked, a smile tugging at her lips despite her exhaustion. Richard nodded, but there was something different in his gaze today, a depth that unsettled her. As she jotted down the order, he spoke. "Helen, do you ever think about what you deserve?" The question caught her off guard. She paused, her pen hovering over the page. "What I deserve," she echoed, unsure how to answer. "Yes," he said simply. "You give so much to others. Do you ever stop to think about what you should receive in return?" Helen hesitated, then shrugged lightly. "I guess I've never really thought about it that way. I've always believed it's better to focus on what you can give." Richard studied her for a moment before nodding. "That's admirable. But even the most giving people need to let others give back sometimes." The comment stayed with her as she moved through the rest of her shift. When Richard's meal was ready, Helen brought it to his table, her thoughts swirling. She noticed that he lingered over his soup, his expression contemplative, as if their conversation had stirred something in him too. When he finished his meal, Richard left the payment on the table as usual, but this time he paused before walking out. "Thank you, Helen," he said, his voice soft yet deliberate, "for everything." After the dinner rush, Helen found herself sitting at the counter, staring at the folded napkin Richard had left alongside his payment. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it, revealing another handwritten message. "Sometimes the smallest acts of courage lead to the greatest changes." The words sent a shiver down her spine. They felt prophetic, as though Richard knew something she didn't. But what? That evening, Helen returned to her small, cluttered music school, determined to find solace in the familiar. The children had gone home, leaving behind an echo of laughter and the faint scent of chalk dust. She sat at the upright piano in the corner, her fingers trailing over the keys. As she began to play, a melody emerged, slow and tentative. It was the song she had played at her wedding, the one she and Frank had danced to under strings of twinkling lights. The memory brought tears to her eyes, but they weren't just tears of sorrow. There was something else, a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years. In the stillness, Helen made a decision. She would continue to pay for Richard's meals, no matter how small her gesture seemed in the grand scheme of things. She couldn't explain it, but something about him, about their brief interactions, made her believe in the power of kindness all over again. The next morning, Helen arrived at the diner early, her resolve firm. She placed an order for 2 breakfasts and had them ready when Richard arrived. When he walked in, she waved him over to a table she had already set for 2. "I thought maybe today we'd eat together," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. Richard's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but a smile slowly spread across his face. "I'd like that," he said, taking the seat across from her. As they shared a quiet meal, Helen found herself opening up more than she intended. She spoke of Frank, of the music school, and of the struggles she faced every day. Richard listened intently, his gaze unwavering, as though her words were the most important thing he'd ever heard. When their plates were cleared, Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Helen," he said, "you remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who believed in the goodness of people, no matter what." "And what happened to them?" she asked, curious. "They changed my life," he replied simply. As Richard left that day, Helen felt something shift within her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of possibility. It was as though, by stepping into the unknown, she had opened a door she hadn't realized was closed. The path ahead was uncertain, but it felt worth exploring. The brisk wind swept through Helen's scarf as she stepped into the diner early that morning. The quiet hum of pre-dawn activity surrounded her, but her thoughts were on the piano at home, the tune she had played lingering in her mind like a ghost. She felt lighter after her breakfast with Richard, but the shadows of doubt still clung to her edges. As she arranged the menus at the counter, the bell above the door jingled. Mrs. Clara entered, her silver hair swept into its usual neat bun. A regular at the diner, Clara was known for her sharp wit and warm heart. She made her way to her usual seat by the window, her cane tapping softly on the floor. "Good morning, Mrs. Clara," Helen said, walking over with a steaming cup of black coffee. "Morning, dear," Clara replied, her eyes twinkling. "You're looking unusually chipper. Something happened?" Helen hesitated, then smiled. "Not really, just feeling a little better, I suppose." Clara raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical but kind. "Well, whatever it is, hold on to it. Good days are worth savoring." Helen sat across from Clara, something she rarely did during her shift. There was a comfort in Clara's presence, a wisdom that seemed to settle the restless corners of Helen's mind. "I've been thinking," Helen began hesitantly, "about kindness and whether it's worth the sacrifices." Clara sipped her coffee thoughtfully before answering. "Kindness isn't a transaction, Helen. It's a seed you plant without knowing what will grow. Sometimes it's nothing, other times it's a tree that offers shade to generations." Helen looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. "But what if the cost feels too high? What if I'm not enough?" Clara leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "You've been enough for the children at that music school, haven't you? For that quiet man who keeps coming back here." "Helen, sometimes we forget that the small things we do ripple outward. You might not see it, but it matters." Helen felt a lump rise in her throat. She nodded, unable to speak, but Clara's words settled deep within her, like water soaking into dry soil. As the day wore on, Helen found herself replaying Clara's advice. It was a balm to the ache of uncertainty she carried, a reminder that perhaps she didn't need all the answers just yet. That evening, as Helen prepared to close the diner, Richard appeared. He was later than usual, his face shadowed with an uncharacteristic weariness. He sat at his usual booth but didn't order right away. Instead, he sat quietly, his hands clasped in front of him. Helen approached, setting a glass of water in front of him. "Rough day?" she asked gently. Richard looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "You could say that." She hesitated, then slid into the seat across from him. It felt bold, uncharacteristic. But something about the way he sat there, so still and heavy, compelled her. "I'm a good listener," she said simply. For a moment, Richard didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was low. "Do you ever feel like the world asks too much of you? Like no matter what you do, it's never enough?" Helen blinked, startled by the question. "Every day," she admitted, "but I keep going because I have to. There's no one else to pick up the slack." Richard nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I used to think that if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, it would all make sense. But I was wrong." Helen tilted her head, curiosity sparking. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as though weighing how much to say. "I've spent my life chasing something. Success, security, recognition. But the more I gained, the emptier it all felt. Lately, I've been wondering if I've been looking for the wrong things." Helen felt a pang of understanding. She thought of Frank, of their modest dreams, and how their happiness had been tied not to what they had, but to what they gave. She nodded, her voice soft. "Sometimes it's not about what you're chasing. It's about what you leave behind." Richard's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You're wiser than most people I've met, Helen." She shrugged lightly, a hint of humor in her tone. "I've had a lot of practice falling down." The tension in Richard's shoulders seemed to ease as they talked. By the time he left, Helen felt a subtle shift in the air, as though something unsaid had passed between them, an unspoken agreement to let their small connection continue to unfold. Later, as Helen locked the diner doors and stepped into the cool night, she thought of Clara's words, of Richard's weariness, and of her own doubts. For the first time in a long while, she felt as though she wasn't facing them alone. Small gestures, small moments, maybe they were enough to plant a seed. Perhaps, just perhaps, something new could grow. Helen glanced at the clock in the music school's tiny office. It was just past noon, but the day already felt endless. Papers cluttered her desk, tuition waivers, recital flyers, and overdue maintenance bills. The children's laughter filtered in from the rehearsal room, a bright counterpoint to the heavy weight pressing on her chest. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Lily stood in the doorway, her violin case hanging from her hand. Her usually cheerful face looked unusually tense. "Miss Helen, do you have a minute?" Lily asked. "Of course. Come in," Helen replied, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. Lily hesitated before sitting. "I wanted to talk about the recital. I've been practicing the solo, but I'm scared." Helen smiled gently. "Scared? Lily, you're one of the most talented players I've ever taught. What's scaring you?" Lily fidgeted with the clasp of her violin case. "It's not just the playing, it's everything. What if I mess up? What if people don't like it?" Helen leaned forward, her voice calm and reassuring. "Lily, music isn't about being perfect. It's about telling a story, sharing a part of yourself. When you play, you do that beautifully." Lily's shoulders relaxed slightly, and Helen felt a swell of pride. This was why she fought so hard for the school, to give kids like Lily a place to grow, to face their fears, and to shine. That afternoon, as Helen prepared to leave for the diner, Maggie, her oldest friend, called. Maggie had been going through a difficult divorce, and though she rarely asked for help, Helen could hear the strain in her voice. "Helen, I hate to bother you, but do you think you could come by tomorrow?" Maggie asked. "I'm trying to pack up some things, and it's overwhelming." Helen hesitated. Her schedule was already packed, but Maggie's voice carried an edge of desperation she couldn't ignore. "Of course," Helen said. "What time?" "Whenever you can. Thank you, Helen. Really." The next day, Helen made the rare decision to skip her usual afternoon at the school. The thought of missing even a few hours with the kids filled her with guilt, but she reminded herself of something Richard had said recently. Even the most giving people need to let others give back. When Helen arrived at Maggie's small apartment, she was struck by how bare it looked. Boxes lined the walls, and the air carried a faint scent of dust and packing tape. Maggie stood in the middle of the chaos, her face pale but grateful. "I didn't know who else to call," Maggie admitted as they embraced. "It's what friends are for," Helen said simply. As they packed, Maggie shared bits and pieces of her struggles, the loneliness, the uncertainty about the future. Helen listened, offering quiet words of encouragement when she could. It reminded her of how many people carried invisible burdens, how kindness often served as a bridge across those silent struggles. By the time Helen returned home that evening, she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and fulfillment. Helping Maggie had drained her physically, but emotionally. It reminded her of the connections that truly mattered. At the diner the following evening, Helen couldn't help but think about how she'd spent her rare day off. It felt indulgent, almost selfish, to take time away from the school. Yet as she served Richard his usual meal, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was a step towards something she'd been missing: balance. Richard seemed to sense her introspection. "You look different today," he said, his tone curious. Helen raised an eyebrow. Different? How? Lighter, he replied, like you've let go of something heavy. She chuckled softly. I helped a friend yesterday. Took a day off from the music school. Richard's eyes widened slightly, as though the idea surprised him. That's rare for you, isn't it? Extremely, she admitted, a wry smile tugging at her lips. But it felt good. Like I was doing something for me, too. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes helping others is a way of helping yourself. It's not selfish, Helen. It's human. His words resonated deeply. Helen found herself replaying them long after Richard left, their simplicity masking a truth she had struggled to accept. Maybe there was room in her life for both giving and receiving, for serving others and tending to her own needs. That night, as Helen sat at her piano, she played not out of habit, but with intention. The melody was her own, a piece she had started years ago but never finished. As her fingers danced over the keys, she realized she wasn't just playing for Frank's memory or the children at the school, she was playing for herself. The music school buzzed with energy as children filled the small rehearsal room, their voices overlapping in cheerful chaos. Helen moved among them, tuning violins and adjusting sheet music, her focus split between preparing for the recital and keeping up with their unending questions. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, a new thread of unease wove through her thoughts. Richard had come to the diner every day that week, lingering longer and engaging her in conversations that felt deeper with each passing day. He asked questions about her life, her dreams and her struggles, listening with an attentiveness that disarmed her. Though his curiosity was genuine, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. Miss Helen, Lily called, snapping her out of her thoughts. Can you listen to my solo again? I've been practicing. Of course, Lily, Helen replied, pulling herself back to the moment. As Lily played, the haunting melody filled the room, drawing the attention of the other students. Helen felt a swell of pride and a pang of something else, a longing for the simplicity of days when music was her only concern, not the endless juggling of bills and responsibilities. Later that afternoon, as Helen prepared for her evening shift at the diner, she found herself looking forward to seeing Richard. She wasn't sure when his presence had become a source of comfort, but she couldn't deny that it had. Yet questions about his past and his intentions lingered at the edges of her mind. When Richard arrived that evening, he chose a seat at the counter instead of his usual booth, an unspoken invitation for a conversation. Helen served him his coffee and grilled cheese, and as she cleaned the counter, she ventured a question that had been nagging her. "Richard, can I ask you something?" she said, her voice careful. "Of course," he replied, his expression open but unreadable. "You've been coming here a lot lately. Why this diner? Why this town?" Richard paused, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He set it down gently and leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I've been looking for something," he said slowly, as though testing the weight of his words. "Or maybe it's more accurate to say I've been trying to remember something." Helen tilted her head, curiosity sparking. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then continued. "I've spent most of my life in places that are loud, fast, full of people who want things from me. But here, it's different. People are different. They're irreal." Helen felt a strange mix of flattery and unease. "Real, huh? And what do you think you found here?" Richard's lips curved into a faint smile. "Kindness," he said simply, "and it's rarer than you think." His words hung in the air, their weight sinking into Helen's chest. She wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but the diner grew busy and the moment slipped away. That night, as Helen locked up, she spotted Richard standing across the street, his silhouette illuminated by the glow of the streetlights. He wasn't heading to a car or waiting for anyone. He just stood there, as if lost in thought. She watched him for a moment, a sense of unease mingling with her growing trust. The next morning, Helen arrived at the music school early, carrying a box of old sheet music she had found in her attic. As she set up for the day, her phone buzzed with a message from Maggie. "Thank you for helping me this week. You're a lifesaver. Let me return the favor soon." The message made Helen smile, but it also reminded her of the precarious balance she was trying to maintain. She couldn't keep giving indefinitely, and yet she didn't know how to stop. Midway through the morning, Helen was startled to see Richard at the school's door. He stood awkwardly, his hands in his pockets, clearly unsure if he was welcome. "Richard?" she asked, walking over. "What are you doing here?" "I was curious," he admitted. "You've talked so much about this place, and I wanted to see it for myself." Helen hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. "Well, welcome to my little corner of the world." Richard wandered the room, his gaze lingering on the children practicing their instruments and the posters on the walls. He seemed genuinely moved, his usual composure giving way to something softer. "This is incredible," he said, his voice low. "You're incredible." Helen felt her cheeks flush. "It's not much," she said, brushing off the compliment, "but it's something." "It's everything," Richard replied, his tone earnest. "You've built something that matters. Not many people can say that." For a moment, Helen didn't know what to say. She saw herself through Richard's eyes. Tired, yes, but also determined. Her life a patchwork of sacrifices that had somehow created beauty. It was a perspective she hadn't allowed herself to consider. As Richard left the school, Helen felt a shift in her understanding of him. He wasn't just a stranger passing through. He was someone searching for meaning, much like she was. Yet questions about his past and his motivations lingered, casting a shadow over the light he brought into her world. Helen stood in the doorway of the music school, watching Richard's retreating figure as the morning sun painted the street in warm hues. His visit had left her unsettled, though not in an unpleasant way. His words echoed in her mind. "You've built something that matters." It was a validation she hadn't realized she craved. As the children filtered in for their lessons, Helen pushed the thoughts aside. The familiar rhythm of their chatter and the sound of instruments tuning filled the room, grounding her. She moved among them, helping one child adjust their bow grip, another with a tricky passage in their sheet music. Halfway through the day, her friend Maggie arrived, a hesitant smile on her face. Helen had invited her to visit the school, hoping it might lift her spirits. "This is amazing, and Helen," Maggie said as she watched the children practice. "I had no idea you were doing all this." "It's a lot of work," Helen admitted, "but it's worth it." Maggie lingered, her eyes softening as she listened to a particularly shy boy play a simple tune on the piano. "You're giving them something they'll carry forever, not just music, hope." Helen smiled, but the weight of Maggie's words pressed on her. She couldn't shake the thought that her ability to give might not last forever. The school's financial strain loomed larger each day, a shadow over the joy she fought to create. Later that afternoon, as Helen locked up the school, Maggie caught her arm. "Helen," she began hesitantly, "I know you're struggling to keep this place running. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Helen shook her head, her smile tinged with weariness. "You've got enough on your plate, Maggie. I'll figure it out." But Maggie's offer lingered in Helen's mind as she made her way to the diner for her evening shift. It was a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone, even if she often felt like she was carrying the world on her shoulders. At the diner, Richard was already waiting at the counter when she arrived. He seemed more relaxed than usual, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. As Helen brought him his coffee, she couldn't help but ask, "How did you like the school?" "It was remarkable," Richard replied. "Seeing those kids, hearing them play, it's clear how much you mean to them." Helen looked away, the compliment striking a chord she wasn't sure she wanted to acknowledge. "It's not just me," she said quietly. "It's the music. It gives them something to hold on to." "Maybe," Richard said, his gaze steady, "but music doesn't walk into their lives on its own. You do that." Helen opened her mouth to respond, but the bell above the door jingled, and her friend Maggie walked in. Her expression was strained, and Helen's heart sank. She motioned for Maggie to join her in a quiet corner. "I didn't know where else to go," Maggie admitted, her voice shaking. "I just found out my ex-husband is fighting me for the house. I don't know how I'm going to make it." Helen reached out, placing a hand over Maggie's. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out." "But you have enough to worry about," Maggie protested. "I can't ask you to take on more." Helen shook her head firmly. "You didn't ask, Maggie. I'm offering." After Maggie left, Helen returned to her duties, her thoughts heavy. When she handed Richard his check, he looked up at her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Everything all right?" he asked. Helen hesitated, then nodded. "A friend's going through a rough time. It's just hard to see people you care about struggling." Richard studied her for a moment, then said, "You're always the one helping, aren't you? Have you ever let someone help you?" Helen chuckled softly, deflecting the question. "I'm not very good at asking for help." "That much is clear," Richard replied, his tone light but pointed, "but maybe it's something worth trying." Later that night, as Helen sat at her piano, she thought about the threads of connection weaving through her life. The children at the school, Maggie and now Richard. Each relationship carried its own weight, its own joys and challenges. She played a soft, meandering melody, her fingers tracing the keys as though searching for answers. For the first time, she wondered if her strength lay not in how much she could carry alone, but in how much she was willing to share. The brisk autumn air greeted Helen as she arrived at the music school early the next morning. The children would soon flood the small space with their energy, but for now, the quiet was soothing. She had spent much of the previous night reflecting on Richard's words and Maggie's struggles. They felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite assemble. Helen busied herself organizing sheet music and checking the tuning of the school's aging instruments. As she worked, her thoughts lingered on the idea of allies. She had always shouldered her burdens alone, but the past few days had made her wonder if it was time to change that. The first sign of change came when Richard appeared at the school's door just before lunch. He carried a small case that looked oddly out of place in his hands. Helen opened the door, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. "Richard? Twice in 2 days?" she asked, unable to keep the curiosity from her tone. He smiled, holding up the case. "I come bearing gifts. Well, alone, technically." Helen stepped aside to let him in, and he set the case on a nearby table. Inside was a beautiful violin, its polished wood gleaming in the soft light. Helen gasped, her hand covering her mouth. "Richard, it's incredible. Where did you get it?" "It belonged to a friend of mine," he said simply. "She wanted it to be played, not collect dust." Helen hesitated, her fingers brushing the instrument's surface. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let the kids use it," Richard replied, his smile soft. "That's all the thanks I need." As the children arrived, the violin became an instant source of fascination. Lily's eyes widened in awe as Helen handed it to her, her hands trembling slightly as she held it. "This is yours to play for the recital," Helen said, her voice filled with emotion. Lily nodded, her excitement infectious, and soon the room buzzed with chatter about the magic violin. For the first time in weeks, Helen felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she didn't have to carry everything alone. Later that afternoon, Maggie stopped by the school. She had brought a thermos of coffee and a bag of sandwiches, insisting Helen take a break. "I thought you might need a little fuel," Maggie said. Setting the bag down on the desk, Helen smiled, her gratitude genuine. "You didn't have to do this, Maggie." "I wanted to," Maggie replied, her voice firm. "You've done so much for me, Helen. It's time I return the favor." The two women sat together in the office, sharing the simple meal as the sounds of the children practicing filtered in from the next room. For the first time in a long while, Helen felt a sense of camaraderie, a reminder that she wasn't as alone as she sometimes believed. As evening approached, Helen headed to the diner for her shift. To her surprise, Mrs. Clara was already seated at the counter, chatting animatedly with Richard. The sight made Helen pause, her heart warming at the unexpected connection between two people who had become important in her life. "Well, this is a pleasant surprise," Helen said as she approached them. Clara turned, her eyes twinkling. "I was just telling this young man here that anyone who takes such an interest in your music school must have a good heart." Richard chuckled, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. "She's been grilling me, but I think I passed." Helen shook her head, a smile tugging at her lips. "I have no doubt." As the evening wore on, Helen felt an unfamiliar lightness. Clara, Maggie, and Richard had all stepped into her life in unexpected ways, creating a web of support she hadn't realized she needed. For the first time, she began to believe that she didn't have to face every challenge alone. By the time Helen returned home that night, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She sat at her piano, the notes flowing freely, her music reflecting the subtle shift in her heart. As the melody filled the room, she realized something profound. Allies didn't just lighten the load, they made the journey richer, more meaningful, and maybe, just maybe, they were the answer she hadn't known she was looking for. Helen arrived at the diner early the next morning, the crisp fall air waking her more effectively than the coffee she had yet to sip. The sun cast long shadows on the quiet streets, and she allowed herself a moment to savor the stillness. The violin Richard had loaned to the music school had ignited a spark of hope in her students, and for the first time in months, Helen felt as though things were beginning to shift. Inside, the diner hummed with the familiar sounds of clinking dishes and murmured conversations. Helen moved through her routine with ease, her thoughts lingering on the upcoming recital. Lily's excitement, the children's progress, even Maggie's renewed determination, all of it felt like a sign that she was on the right path. The bell above the door jingled, and Helen glanced up to see Richard entering. He gave her a small wave before taking his usual seat at the counter. His presence had become so regular that it felt almost natural now, as though he'd always been part of her world. Helen poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him with a smile. "Morning, Richard. Busy day ahead?" "Not particularly," he replied, his tone casual but his eyes thoughtful. "I've been thinking about your school. Have you ever considered hosting a fundraiser?" Helen's brow furrowed as she leaned against the counter. "A fundraiser? I wouldn't even know where to start." Richard's smile widened. "I might have a few ideas. Let's talk after your shift." Before Helen could respond, the diner door opened again, this time with a burst of cold air and the arrival of a man whose presence immediately darkened the room. He wore a scowl as he sat at a booth, slamming the menu onto the table. Helen recognized the type instantly: impatient, entitled, and prone to complaints. She approached the table with her usual warmth. "Good morning, what can I get for you?" The man barely glanced at her, snapping, "Just get me a coffee, black, and make it quick." Helen nodded, suppressing a sigh, and returned to the counter. As she poured the coffee, she felt Richard's gaze on her. "Let me guess. he said quietly. "That's not your favorite kind of customer." Helen chuckled, shaking her head. "It's part of the job." The coffee delivered. Helen tried to ignore the man's muttered complaints about the menu, the temperature of the diner, and even the weather. When she brought him his breakfast, he barely acknowledged her, shoving the plate aside with a grunt. It wasn't until she returned to clear his table that the real confrontation began. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, gesturing to his check. "I shouldn't have to pay for food that was barely edible." Helen took a deep breath, her patience stretched thin. "I'm sorry the meal wasn't to your liking. Let me see if I can—" "You can comp the whole damn thing," he interrupted, his voice rising. "This place is a joke." Before Helen could respond, Richard stood from his seat at the counter and approached the booth. His expression was calm but firm. "Sir, I think you've said enough." The man glared at Richard. "And who the hell are you?" "A regular," Richard replied evenly, "and someone who appreciates the kindness and hard work that goes into running a place like this. If you're unhappy with the service, you're free to leave, but there's no need to take it out on her." Helen's heart pounded as she watched the exchange, her gratitude for Richard's intervention mingling with a flicker of anxiety. The man grumbled under his breath but threw some bills on the table before storming out. Richard turned to Helen, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Thank you for stepping in." "You shouldn't have to deal with that alone," Richard said simply, his tone as steady as his gaze. After the rush died down, Helen found herself lingering at the counter, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. Richard had returned to his seat but hadn't touched his meal, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. "You didn't have to do that," Helen said softly, "but I'm glad you did." Richard smiled faintly. "Kindness goes both ways, Helen. You've shown that to me every day. It's only fair I return the favor." As Helen closed up that evening, the incident played over in her mind. It had been a long time since anyone had stood up for her so openly, and the gesture left her both touched and unsettled. She had spent so much of her life being the one to offer help, the one to absorb the blows of life's hardships, that allowing someone else to defend her felt foreign. That night, as she sat at her piano, she played a melody she hadn't touched in years, a piece Frank had written for her during their early days together. The notes carried a bittersweet weight, echoing through the quiet house. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face the world alone. Perhaps kindness wasn't just something she gave, but something she deserved to receive. Helen stood behind the counter of the diner, the late evening shift winding down to its usual lull. The hum of the coffee machine and the faint chatter of the last few customers filled the room, but her mind was elsewhere. The incident earlier that day, with Richard stepping in to defend her, lingered in her thoughts. His unwavering calm, the way he had spoken up, it wasn't something she was used to. For years, Helen had carried her burden silently, never expecting anyone to lighten the load. Richard sat in his usual spot at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. Tonight, he seemed quieter than usual, his gaze distant, his hands clasped around the mug. Helen wondered if something was weighing on him. "More coffee?" she asked, breaking the silence as she approached him. He looked up, his expression softening. "Sure, thanks." As Helen refilled his cup, she hesitated. There had always been an air of mystery about Richard, a sense that he was more than he seemed. The violin he'd brought to the school, his thoughtful notes, the unexpected ways he supported her, each gesture deepened her curiosity. "Richard," she said cautiously, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied, his voice even. "You're always so kind, so thoughtful," she began, "but I feel like there's more to you than you let on. Why are you here? Why this town, this diner?" Richard's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He set his mug down and leaned back slightly, as though bracing himself. "You're not the first person to wonder," he said, "and I think it's time I tell you." Helen's heart quickened, her curiosity mingling with apprehension. She leaned against the counter, giving him her full attention. "I wasn't always this person," Richard began, his voice measured. "I've spent most of my life in a world that revolves around money and power. It consumed me for years, until I woke up one day and realized how empty it all felt." Helen blinked, surprised by his candor. "You left that life behind?" Richard nodded. "I needed to. I wanted to see if there was still goodness in the world, if people were kind without expecting anything in return. So I started traveling, visiting places like this. And then I met you." Helen felt her cheeks flush, caught off guard by the intensity of his gaze. "Me? You," Richard said, his tone soft but firm. "You reminded me of what I'd forgotten, that kindness can be simple, quiet, and genuine. Watching you give so much, expecting nothing in return, it changed me." Helen's throat tightened, emotions swirling within her. She didn't know what to say, how to process the weight of his words. "But there's something else," Richard continued, his voice dropping. "I didn't tell you the whole truth about the violin." Helen tilted her head, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" "It wasn't just a gift from a friend," he admitted. "It's mine. I bought it years ago. One of many things I collected because I could, not because I needed it. But when I saw your school, saw what you were doing for those kids, I realized it had been wasted with me." Helen stared at him, her mind reeling. The violin, his generosity, the enigmatic way he carried himself, it all began to make sense. "You're wealthy," she said slowly, piecing it together. Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. I still am, though I try not to let it define me anymore." Helen's emotions clashed, gratitude, disbelief, even anger. "So, all this time, you've been watching me, studying me?" "No," Richard said quickly, his voice firm. "It started that way, I won't lie. But it became so much more. You're not some experiment, Helen. You're someone I admire deeply." The sincerity in his tone softened the edges of her confusion, but the revelation still stung. Helen turned away, busying herself with the coffee pot to give herself a moment to think. "I don't know what to say," she admitted after a long pause. "You don't have to say anything," Richard replied. "I just thought you deserved the truth." Helen glanced at him, her emotions still tangled, but her curiosity overpowering her doubt. "And now what? What do you want from me?" "Nothing," he said simply. "I don't want anything. I just wanted you to know who I am, and if there's any way I can help, truly help, I hope you'll let me." The vulnerability in his voice struck a chord in Helen. She thought of the children at the music school, of the struggles that had weighed her down for years. Perhaps, just perhaps, Richard's presence in her life was more than coincidence. As the last customers left and the diner grew quiet, Helen found herself looking at Richard differently. His confession didn't erase her doubts, but it opened a door she hadn't known existed, a possibility that his kindness wasn't just an act, but something genuine, something rare. For now, she decided, that was enough. The night after Richard's revelation, Helen sat at her piano, her fingers resting on the keys without pressing them. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Her mind replayed his words, his confession of wealth, his admission of observing her, and his insistence that she wasn't an experiment, but someone he deeply respected. Helen wanted to believe him. There had been no malice in his voice, no signs of manipulation, yet the idea that he had kept such a significant part of himself hidden made her uneasy. She had trusted him, and now that trust felt fragile. The next morning, Helen busied herself at the music school, diving into the children's lessons with more focus than usual. Lily was working on her recital solo, her bow gliding over the strings of the new violin with growing confidence. But even the joy on Lily's face couldn't banish the unease gnawing at Helen. In the middle of the day, as Helen packed up her things to head to the diner, her phone buzzed. It was Martha. The sight of her daughter's name on the screen sent a pang of anxiety through her. Their last conversation had ended in an argument, and Helen wasn't sure she was ready for another. She answered anyway. "Hi, Martha." "Hi, Mom," Martha said, her tone clipped. "Are you at the school?" "I'm heading to work," Helen replied. "What's going on?" "I just wanted to check if you're still, pouring every last dime into that place," Martha said, her words tinged with frustration. Helen sighed, gripping the phone tighter. "Martha, the school is important." "You know that what I know," Martha snapped, "is that you're drowning, and instead of reaching for a lifeline, you're tying yourself to a sinking ship." The words hit Helen like a punch to the gut. She had heard similar arguments from Martha before, but this time they felt heavier, sharper. "I'm doing what I can, Martha," she said, her voice trembling. "And I'm making a difference for those kids." "And what about making a difference for yourself?" Martha countered. "What about us? You keep giving everything to strangers, and it's like you've forgotten you have a family." Helen's throat tightened. "That's not fair," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Isn't it?" Martha said, the edge in her voice softening slightly. I want you to be okay, Mom. I don't want to lose you to this." The line went quiet, and Helen didn't know how to respond. Finally, Martha sighed. "I have to go. Take care of yourself, okay?" "I'll try," Helen murmured, but the words felt hollow. At the diner, Helen moved through her shift mechanically, her conversation with Martha echoing in her mind. When Richard arrived, she struggled to meet his gaze. He noticed, of course, his brow furrowing as he watched her. "Are you all right?" he asked when she brought his coffee. "I'm fine," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a long day." Richard didn't press her, but his concern was palpable. As the evening wore on and the diner emptied out, he lingered, his quiet presence a constant reminder of the trust she wasn't sure she could fully give him anymore. When the last customer left, Helen leaned against the counter, exhaustion pulling at her shoulders. Richard approached, his hands in his pockets, his expression hesitant. "I don't want to overstep," he began, "but you seem distant. Did I do something to upset you?" Helen sighed, her defenses cracking. "It's not just you, Richard. It's everything. The school, the bills, my daughter. I'm trying to keep it all together. But sometimes it feels impossible." Richard nodded, his gaze steady. "I can't pretend to understand everything you're going through, but I want to help, Helen, truly." She hesitated, the weight of his offer pressing against her doubts. "It's not that simple," she said. "You've already done so much, and I don't even know how to handle that." "You don't have to handle it alone," Richard said softly. "You don't have to handle any of this alone." Helen's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She turned away, busying herself with cleaning the counter. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Richard. I really do, but I need to figure things out on my own." Richard didn't push her. He left quietly, his usual warmth tinged with something like regret. That night, as Helen walked home, she felt the fractures in her relationships more acutely than ever, her strained connection with Martha, her tentative trust in Richard, and the mounting pressure of keeping the music school alive. Each fracture felt like a weight she couldn't bear to mend, yet she knew she couldn't ignore them forever. The morning light filtered into the music school, casting long shadows across the practice room. Helen sat at her small desk, her head resting in her hands as she stared at the stack of letters in front of her. The bold words, "Final Notice," screamed at her from the top envelope. It wasn't the first one she'd received, but this time it wasn't just about overdue bills. It was a notice from the landlord. The music school was at risk of being evicted. Her heart pounded as she reread the letter, the weight of her responsibilities threatening to crush her. She had always managed to scrape by, to find a way to keep the school afloat, but this felt insurmountable. If she couldn't pay the overdue rent within 2 weeks, the school would close. The sound of children arriving pulled Helen out of her thoughts. She plastered on a smile as they filtered in, their laughter filling the room. Lily ran up to her, her face alight with excitement. "Miss Helen, I finally nailed the tricky part of my solo. Want to hear?" she asked eagerly. Helen nodded, forcing her worries to the back of her mind. "Of course, Lily, show me." As Lily played, Helen felt a bittersweet mix of pride and dread. The thought of losing this place, of these children not having a safe space to learn and grow, was unbearable. But the reality of her financial situation loomed over her like a storm cloud. Later that day, as Helen locked up the school, Maggie arrived, her arms full of donations she had collected from a few friends. "It's not much," Maggie said, setting the bags down, "but I thought it might help." Helen smiled, her gratitude genuine. "Every little bit helps, Maggie. Thank you." But even as she spoke the words, she knew the donations wouldn't be enough to cover the mounting expenses. As much as she hated to admit it, the school needed more than goodwill to survive. That evening at the diner, Helen moved through her shift in a daze, her mind replaying the landlord's ultimatum. When Richard arrived, his usual calm demeanor immediately put her on edge. She hadn't spoken to him since their last conversation, and the memory of his offer of help lingered uncomfortably in her mind. "Evening, Helen," he said softly as he took his seat at the counter. "Hi, Richard," she replied, her voice lacking its usual warmth. He studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed. "You seem off. Is everything all right?" Helen hesitated, the urge to confide in him battling with her pride. Finally, she sighed. "It's the school. We're behind on rent, and if I can't come up with the money soon, we'll lose it." Richard's expression darkened with concern. "How much do you need?" The question made Helen stiffen. "Richard, I'm not asking you for money." "I know you're not," he replied calmly. "But I'm offering." She shook her head, frustration bubbling up. "I can't just take your help. It feels wrong." "Why?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Why does it feel wrong to accept help from someone who cares about what you've built?" Helen opened her mouth to respond, but closed it again, unable to articulate her tangled feelings. She hated the idea of relying on someone else, of appearing weak or incapable. Yet, a small part of her couldn't deny the relief his offer brought. Before she could say anything, the bell above the door jingled, and a group of rowdy customers entered, breaking the tension. Helen used the distraction to escape to the kitchen, her emotions swirling. When her shift ended, Helen found Richard waiting outside. He leaned against the wall, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, Helen," he said as she stepped outside. "But I can't stand by and watch you lose something so important without at least trying to help," she sighed, pulling her coat tighter around her. "I appreciate that, Richard. I really do. But this school, it's my responsibility. I have to find a way to fix this myself." Richard nodded, his gaze steady. "I respect that, but if you change your mind, the offer stands." As Helen walked home, her thoughts were a chaotic mess of gratitude, frustration, and fear. The weight of her predicament pressed down on her, but so did the possibility of accepting Richard's help. It wasn't just about the money, it was about trust, pride, and the delicate balance of her own independence. That night, as she sat at her piano, Helen played a hesitant melody, her fingers trembling on the keys. She thought of the children, of Maggie, of Richard's quiet support. The school was more than just a building. It was a lifeline. For her, for the kids, for the community. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that saving it might require more than she could do alone. The next morning, Helen arrived at the music school earlier than usual. The landlord's ultimatum loomed in her mind, but she resolved to make the most of the time they still had. She unlocked the doors and inhaled the familiar scent of aged wood and sheet music. It was a comfort, even amidst her growing fears. By midday, Maggie showed up, her arms full of posters and flyers. Helen blinked in surprise as Maggie began spreading them across a table. "What's all this?" Helen asked, setting down a box of instruments. "A fundraiser," Maggie announced, a determined glint in her eyes. "I've already talked to a few parents, and they're on board. We're going to hold a community concert." Helen's heart lifted, though doubt quickly followed. "Maggie, that's so thoughtful, but organizing something like this takes time and resources." "And that's exactly why we're doing it," Maggie replied firmly. "You've given so much to this school, to these kids. It's time the community gives back." The words hit Helen like a balm to her worries. She had never expected anyone to rally behind her work, but seeing Maggie's determination sparked a flicker of hope. By late afternoon, the school was buzzing with activity. Parents dropped by to help, children rehearsed with renewed vigor, and Maggie directed everyone with an enthusiasm that was impossible to ignore. Even Helen's usual doubts began to wane as the plans came together. When Richard arrived unannounced, his presence no longer startled her. He watched the flurry of activity with quiet interest before approaching Helen. "I hear there's a fundraiser in the works," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. Helen smiled, a touch of pride seeping into her tone. "Maggie's idea." "She's really taking the lead," Richard nodded. "It's a good idea. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." Helen hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "We might need volunteers for setup." "Are you up for some heavy lifting?" Richard chuckled. "I think I can manage that." The week leading up to the concert was a whirlwind of preparation. Helen spent her days at the school, rehearsing with the children and coordinating logistics, and her evenings at the diner, trying to keep her usual routine afloat. The exhaustion was relentless, but the anticipation of the concert kept her going. The day of the event arrived, and the small auditorium borrowed from a nearby church was transformed. Strings of fairy lights crisscrossed the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the stage. Rows of chairs filled quickly as families, neighbors, and even a few strangers filed in. As the concert began, Helen sat backstage, her nerves tangled with pride. Lily's solo was the highlight of the evening, her performance so moving that the audience erupted into applause. Helen wiped away a tear, overwhelmed by the moment. After the final bow, Helen addressed the audience, her voice shaking slightly as she expressed her gratitude. "This school isn't just about music," she said. "It's about hope, connection, and creating something beautiful together. Thank you for being part of that." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Helen felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. By the end of the night, the fundraiser had raised more than Helen had dared to hope. While it wasn't enough to completely cover the school's debt, it was a significant start. As the last attendees left, Maggie hugged her tightly. "You did it, Helen," Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion. "We all did." Helen smiled, the relief settling into her bones. "Thank you, Maggie. I couldn't have done this without you." As they cleaned up, Richard approached Helen, his hands in his pockets. "That was remarkable," he said, his voice low. "It was," Helen agreed, her smile tinged with exhaustion. "But we still have a long way to go." Richard nodded. "True, but tonight was proof that you're not alone in this." Helen felt her cheeks warm at the sincerity in his voice. She had spent so much of her life carrying everything on her own shoulders, but tonight had shown her the power of sharing that load. As she walked home in the cool night air, Helen reflected on the small victory. The school wasn't saved yet, but for the first time she felt like it could be, and for the first time she allowed herself to imagine what might be possible if she let others help her along the way. The morning after the fundraiser, Helen woke with a rare lightness in her chest. She lingered over her coffee, savoring the warmth and quiet. For the first time in months, the looming shadow of the school's financial troubles felt less oppressive. The concert had not only brought in much-needed funds, but also renewed her sense of purpose. She wasn't alone. Maggie, Richard, and the community had rallied around her in ways she never expected. By mid-morning, Helen was at the school, the familiar hum of activity already filling the air. Parents had dropped by to help clean up after the fundraiser, and the children, still buzzing from their performances, practiced with fresh enthusiasm. As Helen moved among them, adjusting bows and encouraging hesitant players, she felt a surge of gratitude for the life she had built, despite its challenges. Lily approached her, her violin in hand, and her expression serious. "Miss Helen," she said, her voice soft, "do you think we'll ever have more space? Sometimes it's hard to practice when everyone's so close together." Helen knelt to Lily's level, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "I hope so, Lily. That's why we're working so hard, to make this place even better for all of you." Lily nodded, her confidence bolstered. "I believe you can do it." The simple statement struck Helen with unexpected force. In Lily's eyes, she wasn't just a teacher, she was a beacon, someone who made the impossible seem achievable. The weight of that responsibility was daunting, but it was also empowering. Helen rose, her resolve hardening. Later that day, Maggie stopped by with a stack of thank you notes they had written for the fundraiser donors. They sat together in the small office, addressing envelopes and chatting about the concert's success. "You know," Maggie said, pausing to tap her pen against the table, "you've done something extraordinary, Helen. Not just for the kids, but for all of us. This school is a reminder that good things still exist." Helen smiled, the compliment warming her. "I couldn't have done it without you, without everyone." Maggie shook her head. "You could have, but you didn't. That's what makes it special." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Richard, who carried a box of books and music sheets. "Thought these might be useful," he said, setting the box on the desk. Helen glanced inside, her breath catching at the sight of vintage music scores and instructional guides. "Richard, where did you find these?" "A friend of mine is an antique collector," he replied casually. "I told her about your school, and she insisted on donating them." Helen ran her fingers over the worn covers, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "These are incredible." As the day wound down and the school emptied, Helen found herself alone in the practice room. She sat at the piano, her fingers brushing the keys. The melody she had started playing weeks ago, the one Frank had written, returned to her. She played it slowly, letting the notes guide her thoughts. Her life had always been a balancing act, a constant struggle to keep going despite the weight of her grief, her responsibilities, and her doubts. But the fundraiser, the support of her friends, and the belief of her students had shown her something she hadn't allowed herself to fully see. She was stronger than she thought. The door creaked open, and Helen turned to see Richard standing there. He hesitated, as though unsure if he should intrude. but she motioned him inside. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, his voice low. "That was beautiful." "Thank you," Helen replied, her fingers still resting on the keys. "It's a piece my husband wrote." Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful. He must have been an incredible man. "He was," Helen said, her voice tinged with both sorrow and pride. "And I like to think he'd be proud of what I've done with this school." "I'm sure he would be," Richard said firmly. "What you've built here, it's extraordinary." Helen met his gaze, her earlier doubts about him softening. "Thank you, Richard, for everything." He smiled, the warmth in his expression unmistakable. "You've done more for me than you realize, Helen." As he left, Helen sat at the piano, her thoughts turning to the journey ahead. The school wasn't saved yet, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose and strength. She had allies, a community, and a belief in herself she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, Helen allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't just about survival, but about thriving. And as she played the final notes of Frank's melody, she realized she was ready to face whatever came next. The air outside the diner was crisp that evening, the first hints of winter biting at Helen's cheeks as she stood by the door, gripping her coat tightly. Inside, the diner buzzed softly with the hum of late-night customers and clinking silverware. Helen had just finished her shift, but her heart was heavy and her thoughts refused to settle. Richard had been distant since their conversation at the school. Though he still came to the diner, his presence was quieter, his words fewer. Helen couldn't tell if it was her hesitance that had pushed him away, or if he had grown weary of waiting for her to let him in. Either way, it left her with an ache she didn't fully understand. Tonight, he had lingered longer than usual, sitting at his usual counter seat long after most of the other customers had left. When she approached to clear his empty plate, he looked up at her, his gaze searching. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Helen hesitated, her pulse quickening. "Of course," she said, motioning toward an empty booth. They sat across from each other, the quiet of the nearly empty diner wrapping around them. Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his tone measured. "Something I should have said a long time ago." Helen's stomach tightened, a mix of anticipation and apprehension swirling within her. "I'm listening." Richard took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "I told you the truth about wanting to find something real, about leaving behind a life that felt empty, but I didn't tell you everything." Helen's hands tightened around her coffee mug. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then spoke, his words deliberate. "My name isn't just Richard, it's Richard Maxwell, and I'm not just some guy passing through. Well, let's just say I've been called a lot of things, an entrepreneur, a billionaire, even a recluse." The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Helen stared at him, her mind racing to reconcile the man sitting across from her with the image his confession conjured. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to see if it was possible to just exist, to be treated like anyone else," Richard continued, his voice tinged with regret. "And when I met you, Helen, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, someone who gives without expecting anything in return, someone who reminded me what it means to believe in people." Helen's chest tightened, a storm of emotions rising within her, shock, anger, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite name. "So, all this time, you were hiding who you really are." "I wasn't hiding," Richard said, his voice pleading. "I was trying to be honest about the parts of me that matter, but I know it was wrong to withhold the truth. And I'm sorry." Helen looked away, her thoughts a chaotic tangle. She'd opened her life to Richard, trusted him with her dreams and fears. And now she realized she hadn't known him at all. "Why tell me now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because you deserve the truth, Richard said simply. And because I want to help you, Helen, not just with the school, but with anything you need. I have the resources, and I want to use them for something meaningful. Helen shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. You don't understand. It's not just about the money. It's about trust, about knowing who someone really is. I know, Richard said, his voice firm but gentle. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn that trust back. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Helen's mind reeled, the weight of his revelation pressing against her chest. She thought of the children at the school, the fundraiser, the violin he had brought. Each act had been genuine, she knew that, but it didn't erase the sting of his deception. Finally, she met his gaze, her voice steady, despite the turmoil inside her. I need time, Richard. Time to figure out how I feel about all this. Richard nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. As Helen locked the diner that night, she felt the enormity of the moment settle over her. Richard's confession had upended her perception of him, but it also opened a door she hadn't expected, a possibility she wasn't sure she was ready to explore. For now, all she could do was take it one step at a time, her heart and mind grappling with the truth of who Richard Maxwell really was. The morning after Richard's confession, Helen awoke with a heaviness she couldn't shake. The weight of his words lingered in her mind, mingling with her memories of their interactions. She had trusted him, and yet she couldn't ignore the feeling that her trust had been betrayed. Sitting at her small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, she tried to make sense of the whirlwind in her heart. By mid-morning, Helen arrived at the music school. The familiar sound of children tuning their instruments greeted her, but today it felt distant, like a melody she couldn't quite reach. She smiled at Lily, who was already practicing her solo, but her thoughts remained elsewhere. As she moved through the day, Maggie stopped by carrying a bag of groceries. Thought you could use a little help, Maggie said, setting the bag on the counter in the tiny office. Helen forced a smile, grateful for Maggie's thoughtfulness but unable to fully focus. Thank you, you didn't have to. Of course, I didn't have to, Maggie replied, her tone firm but kind. That's what friends are for. Helen hesitated, then asked, Maggie, have you ever felt like someone you trusted wasn't who you thought they were? Maggie raised an eyebrow as she sat across from Helen. This about Richard? Helen nodded, unable to meet her friend's gaze. He told me the truth last night about who he really is. He's wealthy, very wealthy, and he's been helping us this whole time without me knowing his full story. Maggie leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. And how does that make you feel? I don't know, Helen admitted, her voice tinged with frustration, angry, confused, maybe even a little grateful. It's complicated. Maggie nodded slowly. Sounds like he's trying to make amends. The question is, can you let him? Helen sighed, the question hanging heavy between them. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. Later that afternoon, as Helen sat at the piano guiding a shy student through a new piece, Mrs. Clara arrived. The older woman, with her sharp eyes and warm smile, had become a constant source of wisdom for Helen. Today, her presence felt like a lifeline. You've got a storm cloud over you today, Helen, Clara remarked as she took a seat nearby. What's weighing you down? Helen hesitated, then recounted Richard's confession. Clara listened intently, her hands resting on her cane as Helen poured out her doubts and frustrations. When Helen finished, Clara leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. You've always seen the best in people, Helen. It's one of your greatest strengths. But sometimes it also makes you question yourself when someone lets you down. Helen nodded, her chest tightening. I just don't know if I can trust him again. Trust isn't given all at once, Clara said, her tone softening. "It's built, piece by piece. If he's willing to try, and you're willing to let him, you might find he's more than the mistakes he's made." The words settled over Helen like a gentle rain, soothing some of the tension in her heart. She still didn't know what to do, but Clara's perspective offered a glimmer of clarity. That evening, after the children had gone home, Helen lingered in the practice room. The quiet felt heavier than usual, the shadows stretching long across the floor. She sat at the piano, her fingers brushing the keys but not playing. Instead, she thought of Richard, of his quiet moments of kindness, his steadfast presence, and the vulnerability he had shown in his confession. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. She turned to see Martha standing in the doorway, her expression hesitant but determined. "Hi, Mom," Martha said, stepping inside. Helen blinked, surprised by her daughter's unexpected visit. "Martha? What are you doing here?" "I've been thinking," Martha began, her voice soft, "about what I said the other day. I was harsh, and I'm sorry. I want you to be okay." Helen stood, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. "I know, sweetheart, and I want you to understand why I do this. It's not just about the kids, it's about me, too. This school keeps me going." Martha nodded, her eyes glistening. "I think I'm starting to see that." The two women embraced, the tension between them softening. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start, a step toward mending what had been fractured for too long. As Helen walked home that night, she felt a quiet resolve settling in her heart. Trust, like music, required patience, practice, and faith. Whether it was with Richard, with Martha, or with herself, she knew rebuilding would take time. But for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to try. The morning light streamed through the small windows of the music school, casting a warm glow on the familiar clutter of sheet music and well-worn instruments. Helen stood in the corner, surveying the space. It still felt like a sanctuary, but now there was something else, a sense of fragile hope, like a delicate thread she was afraid to tug too hard. The visit from Martha the previous night had lingered in her thoughts, softening the ache she often carried from their strained relationship. Their conversation wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and for that, Helen was grateful. The day began quietly. The children filtered in, their laughter filling the space as they prepared for their lessons. Helen busied herself with organizing new music Richard had donated, her mind wandering to his confession. Trust wasn't something she could offer freely, not after being blindsided by his secret, but there was a part of her that wanted to try. She couldn't deny the sincerity in his words, the quiet way he had supported her from the beginning. By mid-morning, Maggie arrived, her arms full of homemade flyers. "Good news," Maggie said with a triumphant smile. "The church agreed to host another fundraiser next month. We're calling it Music Under the Stars." Helen blinked, her chest tightening with gratitude. "Maggie, that's amazing. I don't even know what to say." "Say you'll let me help with the planning," Maggie replied, her tone firm but teasing. "This isn't just your fight, Helen. We're in it together." Helen nodded, her smile soft. She wasn't used to letting others share her burdens, but Maggie's unwavering support was something she could no longer ignore. As the day wore on, Helen's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Richard. "Would you meet me at the diner tonight? I'd like to talk." Helen stared at the message, her emotions swirling. She debated whether to reply, but something in her heart nudged her forward. After her shift at the diner, she decided she would meet him. That evening, the diner was quiet, the dinner rush long over. Helen sat at a booth near the window, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea as she waited for Richard to arrive. When he walked in, he carried the same quiet presence she had grown familiar with, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Thanks for coming," Richard said as he slid into the seat across from her. Helen nodded, her gaze steady. "You said you wanted to talk." Richard hesitated, then leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I know I've asked for your trust, and I know I haven't earned it yet, but I want to show you that I mean what I said." "How?" Helen asked, her voice soft but firm. "I want to help your school, not just financially," Richard began. "I want to partner with you, to expand what you've already built. Imagine being able to reach more kids, offer better resources, maybe even create scholarships for those who need them most." Helen's heart pounded at the possibilities his words conjured, but skepticism tempered her excitement. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because what you're doing matters," Richard said, his tone earnest. "It's not just about the music. It's about giving these kids a chance, a place where they feel seen and valued. That's something money alone can't create, but together I think we can make it even bigger." Helen searched his eyes, looking for any sign of insincerity. All she saw was a man who seemed genuinely invested, not just in her school, but in the vision it represented. "I don't want to lose what makes the school special," she said finally. "It's small, it's personal. I don't want it to become something it's not." "And it won't," Richard assured her. "I promise, Helen, this will be your vision. I'm just offering the means to make it happen." Helen leaned back, her mind racing. The school's future had always felt precarious, like a dream held together with frayed threads. Now, Richard was offering her a lifeline, a chance to not just save the school, but to grow it into something greater than she'd ever imagined. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice steady. "But I need time, Richard. This is a lot to take in." "Take all the time you need," Richard said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not going anywhere." As Helen walked home that night, her thoughts were a tangle of possibilities and fears. She couldn't deny that Richard's offer was tempting, but accepting it meant letting go of some of her independence, her control. Yet for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what could be, a school that thrived, not just survived. The idea both terrified and exhilarated her, but as she climbed the steps to her small house and stepped inside, she realized one thing. If she wanted to keep her dream alive, she couldn't do it alone. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to. The brisk air carried the scent of autumn leaves as Helen walked to the music school the next morning. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the faint hum of a passing car. Her conversation with Richard lingered in her thoughts, the possibilities he'd presented stirring equal parts excitement and fear. For years, she had fought to keep the school alive with sheer determination, never imagining it could grow into something larger. But now, the idea felt within reach, if she could only muster the courage to take the leap. As Helen entered the school, the familiar sights and sounds greeted her, the children unpacking their instruments, the soft chatter of parents dropping them off, and the faint hum of a violin being tuned. It was a world she had built with love and sacrifice, and the thought of sharing it with someone else, of expanding it, felt both thrilling and overwhelming. Midway through the morning, Maggie burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement. "Helen!" she called, waving a large envelope. "You're not going to believe this!" Helen set down the sheet music she was organizing and approached Maggie. "What's going on?" Maggie handed her the envelope. "It's from one of the fundraiser attendees. Open it." Helen hesitated, her heart pounding as she slid her finger under the flap. Inside was a handwritten letter and a check. Her breath caught when she saw the amount, enough to cover the overdue rent and then some. "Who?" Helen began, her voice trembling. "It's anonymous," Maggie said, her grin wide. "They wrote that they were moved by the concert and wanted to support the school." Tears sprang to Helen's eyes as she clutched the letter to her chest. Relief and gratitude surged through her, mingling with disbelief. It's a miracle. It's your hard work paying off, Maggie corrected. People see what you're doing, Helen. They want to be part of it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of excitement and renewed energy. The children practiced with fresh determination, and Helen's mind whirled with plans to secure the school's future. The anonymous donation felt like a sign, a push toward embracing the possibilities Richard had spoken of. That evening, as Helen prepared to lock up, Richard arrived unannounced. He carried a small box under one arm, his expression warm but cautious. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "Not at all," Helen replied, gesturing him inside. "We just wrapped up for the day." Richard set the box on a nearby table and opened it to reveal a sleek tablet and a binder filled with neatly organized documents. "I thought these might help," he said. "The tablet has software for managing donations, scheduling, and communications. And the binder has some ideas for expansion if you're ready to explore them." Helen stared at the items, her emotions a mix of awe and hesitation. "You've put so much thought into this." "I have," Richard admitted, "because I believe in what you're doing, Helen, and I want to help in any way I can." Helen ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the tablet, her thoughts swirling. Richard's gesture was thoughtful, practical, and undeniably generous. It was a reminder that he wasn't just offering her money, he was offering partnership, support, and belief in her vision. "I don't know what to say," she said finally, her voice soft. "You don't have to say anything now," Richard replied. "Just think about it. This is your school, your dream. I'm here to support you, whatever that looks like." Helen nodded, her chest tight with emotion. As Richard left, she sat alone in the quiet of the school, the tablet and binder before her. The possibilities they represented felt vast and daunting, but also full of promise. The following week, the church hosted another fundraiser, Music Under the Stars. The community came together once more, filling the hall with warmth and laughter. The children performed with heart and precision, their music weaving a spell over the audience. At the end of the night, as Helen addressed the crowd, she felt a surge of pride and gratitude. "This school is more than a place to learn music," she said, her voice steady. "It's a place where dreams take root, where hope grows. Thank you for being part of this journey." The applause was deafening, and as Helen stepped off the stage, Richard approached her. "You've built something extraordinary," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "So have you," Helen replied, her smile soft. "Thank you for believing in me." Richard looked at her, his eyes steady. "It's easy to believe in something so beautiful." As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Helen stood in the quiet hall, the echoes of applause still ringing in her ears. She realized she was no longer carrying the weight of the school's future alone. It wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the children, the community, and, in a way, to Richard, who had stepped into her life and offered her a way forward she hadn't dared to imagine. For the first time, Helen allowed herself to believe in the possibility of not just surviving, but thriving. And as she walked into the crisp night air, she felt a quiet strength growing within her, ready to face whatever came next. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the music school's windows, illuminating the well-loved instruments and faded posters on the walls. Helen stood at the piano, her fingers gliding over the keys as she played a melody that had been looping in her mind. It was one Frank had written but never finished. She allowed the notes to flow freely, filling the space with a bittersweet harmony that seemed to reflect her journey. The success of the Music Under the Stars fundraiser had been a turning point. With the anonymous donation and community support, the school was no longer in immediate danger. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. The vision Richard had shared with her, The possibility of expanding the school, reaching more children, and creating a lasting legacy lingered in her thoughts. As the children arrived, their laughter and chatter filled the room. Helen greeted each of them with a smile, her earlier doubts replaced by cautious optimism. Today, she planned to share her decision with Richard, a choice she had made after days of reflection and late-night conversations with herself at the piano. By mid-morning, Maggie arrived with a tray of coffee and a mischievous grin. "You're looking more determined than usual," she observed, handing Helen a cup. Helen laughed softly. "That obvious, huh?" "Like a spotlight," Maggie teased. "What's the plan?" Helen took a sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth before replying, "I'm going to accept Richard's offer. Not all of it, not yet, but I want to see what we can build together." Maggie's grin widened. "I knew you'd come around. He's got a good heart, Helen. And you've got the vision." It's a perfect match. The weight of her decision settled over Helen, but instead of fear, she felt a quiet confidence. She wasn't giving up control. She was gaining a partner, someone who believed in her dream as much as she did. That afternoon, as the children packed up their instruments, Helen spotted Richard arriving at the school. He carried a small box, his expression unreadable but calm. Helen met him at the door, her smile tentative but genuine. "Got a minute?" she asked. "For you, always," Richard replied, stepping inside. They walked to the small office, and Helen closed the door behind them. She gestured for him to sit, then took the chair across from him. For a moment, she simply studied him, the man who had become an unlikely ally in her journey. "I've thought a lot about what you said," Helen began, her voice steady. "About expanding the school, about working together. And I've decided I'm ready to try." Richard's eyes lit up, his relief palpable. "That's wonderful, Helen, truly. But," she continued, holding up a hand, "I want to take it slow. I need to be sure that this remains what it's always been, a place for kids to feel safe, to learn and to grow. I don't want to lose that." "You won't," Richard assured her. "This will always be your vision. I'm here to support it, not change it." Helen nodded, her shoulders relaxing. "Then let's do this." Richard reached into the box he'd brought and pulled out a folder. Inside were detailed plans for fundraising, outreach programs, and partnerships with other organizations. Helen flipped through the pages, her excitement growing with each idea. "This is incredible," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "It's just the beginning," Richard replied. "With the right support, we can turn this school into something even more impactful." For the rest of the afternoon, they worked side by side, outlining the next steps and brainstorming ideas. Helen's fears began to fade, replaced by a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. Richard's expertise and resources combined with her passion and vision created a synergy she hadn't expected. By evening, as the last of the children left, Helen and Richard stood in the now quiet school. The day's work had left her energized rather than exhausted, a rarity she savored. "Thank you," she said softly, meeting his gaze, "for believing in this, for believing in me." Richard smiled, his expression warm. "You make it easy, Helen." As they locked up the school, the cool night air wrapped around them. Helen felt lighter, as though the burdens she had carried alone for so long had finally begun to lift. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to embrace it fully. Walking home, Helen let herself imagine what the school could become, not just a place of learning, but a beacon of hope for the community. And as she turned the key in her door, she realized that her journey wasn't just about building a school. It was about building a life she could be proud of, one that honored her past while forging a new path forward. The morning sunlight spilled through the windows of Helen's small kitchen, casting golden rays on the stack of papers on the table. Contracts, Grant applications and new student registrations lay neatly arranged, each representing a step toward the music school's transformation. Helen sipped her coffee, a mix of anticipation and apprehension bubbling within her. The decision to work with Richard had shifted something deep inside her. For years, she had carried the weight of the school alone, often wondering if her efforts were enough. Now, the idea of partnership, of shared responsibility, was both exhilarating and unsettling. She wasn't used to letting someone else share the load. Later that morning, Helen arrived at the school, greeted by the cheerful clamor of children unpacking their instruments. The new energy in the air was palpable. Lily waved at her from across the room, a grin lighting up her face. "Miss Helen, I've been practicing the new song you gave me," Lily said, running up to her. "Want to hear?" Helen crouched to Lily's level, her heart warming at the girl's enthusiasm. "I'd love to. Let's hear it after class, okay?" As the day unfolded, Helen couldn't help but notice how seamlessly things had started falling into place. The anonymous donation had provided the school with a much-needed cushion, and Richard's resources had opened doors she never thought possible. New students were enrolling, and there was even talk of a community outreach program that would bring music to underserved neighborhoods. By midday, Maggie arrived with a box of supplies. She set it down with a triumphant grin. "The community's been pitching in," she announced. "We've got new music stands, sheet music, and even a few donations for scholarships." Helen smiled, her gratitude overflowing. "Maggie, you've been incredible." "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Maggie replied, her voice soft. "This school isn't just your dream anymore, Helen. It's all of ours." Later in the afternoon, Richard arrived with a guest, a local philanthropist he had introduced to the school's mission. The woman, elegant but approachable, listened intently as Helen walked her through the classrooms and practice spaces. By the end of the tour, she had promised to fund a portion of the outreach program. As Helen stood with Richard after the philanthropist left, she turned to him, her voice filled with wonder. "This is really happening, isn't it?" "It is," Richard replied, his smile gentle. "And it's all because of you." Helen shook her head, her gaze steady. "Because of us? I couldn't have done this alone." Richard's expression softened, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their shared journey hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. That evening, as Helen locked up the school, she paused to take in the quiet, the old piano in the corner, the posters on the walls, the rows of chairs. All of it felt like a part of her, a testament to years of perseverance and love. But now, it also felt like something more, a beacon of what was possible when she allowed others to help. Walking home under a canopy of stars, Helen reflected on how far she had come. The weight of her burdens had lessened, not because the challenges had disappeared, but because she was no longer carrying them alone. The school was thriving, her relationship with Martha was healing, and she was beginning to see Richard not just as an ally, but as someone who might be more than that. Back at home, Helen sat at her piano and played the melody she had been working on for weeks. This time, it felt complete. The notes carried a quiet strength, a reflection of her journey, a renewal of her belief in herself and the people around her. As the last notes faded into the night, Helen allowed herself a moment of stillness. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't feel daunting. It felt like a promise. The crisp morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves as Helen arrived at the music school. A soft layer of dew clung to the grass, and the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden shadows on the ground. She paused at the door, taking in the scene. A group of children practicing scales in the yard under Maggie's watchful eye. their laughter blending harmoniously with the sound of the instruments. Inside, the school buzzed with activity. A shipment of donated instruments had arrived earlier that morning, and Helen found Richard unpacking the boxes alongside a few volunteers. He looked up as she entered, his expression warm. "Good morning," he greeted, setting down a violin case. "We've got a few beauties in this shipment. You should take a look." Helen approached, marveling at the pristine instruments. "This is incredible," she said, running her fingers over the polished wood. "I can't believe how much support we've gotten." "It's a testament to what you've built," Richard replied. "People want to be part of something meaningful." Helen's smile faltered slightly as she turned to him. "It's not just me anymore, Richard. You've been a huge part of this too." Richard met her gaze, his eyes steady. "It's an honor to help, Helen. You've inspired more people than you realize, including me." The weight of his words lingered between them, unspoken feelings flickering like a candle in the space they shared. Helen looked away, busying herself with the task of organizing the new instruments. The school had become a lifeline, not just for the children, but for her as well. It gave her purpose, hope, and increasingly a connection she hadn't anticipated with Richard. By midday, the school was in full swing. Helen led a group of students through a challenging piece, while Maggie worked with parents on the details of the upcoming outreach program. The energy in the room was electric. Each note played a step towards something greater. As the afternoon waned, Martha arrived unexpectedly. Helen spotted her lingering by the doorway, her expression hesitant but curious. Setting down her sheet music, Helen approached, her heart swelling with equal parts joy and nervousness. "Martha," she said, smiling, "this is a surprise." "I wanted to see the school," Martha replied, her voice tentative. "I realized I've never actually been here." Helen gestured for her to come inside. "Let me show you around." Martha followed her through the classrooms and practice spaces, her expression softening as she took in the joyful chaos. Helen explained the programs, the children's progress, and the plans for expansion, her passion spilling into every word. At the end of the tour, Martha turned to her, her eyes glistening. "I didn't understand before, Mom. I thought this was just something you were doing to fill the time. But it's so much more, isn't it?" Helen nodded, her throat tight. "It is. It's a part of me, Martha, and it's for them, for these kids who need a place to belong." Martha reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm proud of you. I don't say that enough, but I am." Tears welled in Helen's eyes as she embraced her daughter. The moment felt like a small piece of healing, a bridge being rebuilt after years of misunderstanding. As the day wound down and the children began to leave, Helen sat on the steps outside the school, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. Richard joined her, his presence quiet but grounding. "You've had quite the day," he remarked. Helen nodded, her gaze on the horizon. "Martha came by. She said she's proud of me." "That's wonderful," Richard said, his voice warm. "You deserve that, Helen." She turned to him, the words she had been holding back finally spilling out. "You've changed my life, Richard. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his tone gentle. "I'm just grateful to be part of this." For a moment, they sat in silence, the connection between them deepening in the quiet. Helen felt a warmth she hadn't known in years, a sense of possibility she was just beginning to trust. As the last light of the day faded, Helen rose, a renewed strength settling in her chest. The school was thriving. Her relationship with Martha was healing, and with Richard, she felt the stirrings of something new and unexpected. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like a promise she was ready to embrace. The church auditorium was alive with anticipation. the soft hum of conversation blending with the occasional tuning of an instrument. Rows of chairs filled with parents, friends and community members formed a sea of support. The upcoming recital wasn't just another performance, it was a celebration of everything the music school had become. Helen stood backstage, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She watched as the children gathered, their excitement palpable. Lily was front and center, her violin tucked securely under her arm as she chatted with her peers. The new violin Richard had donated glinted under the stage lights, a symbol of hope and renewal. Maggie appeared beside Helen, holding a clipboard. "It's a full house," she said, her grin wide. "I hope you're ready for this." Helen let out a soft laugh. "I don't think I'll ever be ready for something like this. But it's not about me, it's about them." "And about you," Maggie countered gently. "You made this happen, Helen. Don't forget that." As the lights dimmed and the audience grew quiet, Helen stepped onto the stage. Her heart raced as she stood at the microphone, the weight of the moment pressing against her. She looked out at the faces of the community, her daughter Martha seated in the front row, and Richard standing near the back, his presence steady and reassuring. "Good evening, everyone," Helen began, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for being here tonight. This school started as a dream, a way to share the power of music with children who might not otherwise have the chance. But it's become so much more. It's a community, a family, and a place where we all learn from each other." The applause that followed was warm and encouraging. Helen stepped aside, letting the children take the stage. As the first notes of the recital filled the room, a wave of emotion washed over her. Each piece the children performed carried a piece of their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. When it was Lily's turn, the auditorium grew even quieter. She stepped forward, her small frame dwarfed by the stage, but her confidence shone. The first note she played was clear and strong, and the audience was captivated. The melody swelled, and for a moment, Helen felt as though she could hear Frank's voice in the music, a reminder of why she had started this journey. By the end of the recital, the audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation filling the hall. The children bowed, their faces alight with pride. Helen stepped onto the stage once more, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for believing in us, for supporting these children, and for being part of this dream. We couldn't have done it without you." As the crowd dispersed and the children packed up their instruments, Helen stood in the quiet of the auditorium, taking it all in. The space that had once felt overwhelming now felt like home, a testament to everything they had built together. Richard approached, his hands in his pockets, a small smile on his lips. "You were incredible," he said. "It wasn't just me," Helen replied, her voice soft. "It was all of us." Richard nodded, his gaze steady. "Still, you should be proud. This is your legacy, Helen." She met his eyes, the weight of his words settling in her chest. "Our legacy," she said, surprising herself with the inclusion. "I couldn't have done this without you, Richard." The warmth in his smile deepened, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. In his eyes, she saw not just gratitude, but something deeper, something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. As they stood together in the empty auditorium, Helen felt a sense of completion she hadn't known in years. The school was thriving, the children were flourishing, and her connections with Maggie, with Martha, and with Richard had become the foundation of a life she was finally proud of. That night, as Helen walked home, the stars seemed brighter, the air lighter. She thought of everything they had overcome, of the bridges they had built and the dreams they had made real. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace, ready to embrace whatever the future might bring. The final weeks of autumn swept through the small town with a quiet, golden beauty. Helen walked to the music school one crisp morning. the air fragrant with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The fundraiser's success and the recital's triumph had brought the community closer than ever. Every time Helen passed someone on the street, she was met with smiles and kind words about the school. It was no longer just her dream, it had become a shared endeavor. Inside the school, the children were practicing for their next performance, an outreach concert at a nearby community center. The excitement in the air was infectious. Lily, with her new violin, had become a confident leader among the students, often helping the younger ones with their pieces. Watching her, Helen felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Maggie arrived later in the day, carrying a tray of sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. "I thought you could use a break," she said, setting everything down on the desk. Helen laughed softly. "You always know when I need a little push to take care of myself." "That's what friends are for," Maggie replied, her voice warm. "And you've earned it, Helen." "Look at what you've built." Helen glanced around the school, her heart swelling. "It's not just me, Maggie, it's all of us." Maggie sat beside her, her tone softening. "Do you know how much you've changed, Helen? When I met you, you were carrying everything on your own shoulders. Now you've let people in, you've let them love you." Helen blinked back tears, her chest tightening. "It wasn't easy. But I couldn't have done this alone." As the day went on, Richard arrived, as he often did, to discuss upcoming plans for the school. This time, he brought news. "I've secured a grant from a foundation I've worked with before," he said, handing Helen a folder. "It's enough to fund the outreach program for the next 3 years. Helen stared at the document, her hand covering her mouth. "Richard, I don't know how to thank you." "You've already done that," he said softly. "This is your dream, Helen. I'm just honored to help it grow." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of everything they'd shared hung between them. The trust they had rebuilt, the support they had offered each other, it had become something unspoken but deeply felt. Later that evening, after the children had gone home, Helen lingered in the practice room. The piano sat in the corner, its keys slightly worn, but still capable of producing the most beautiful sound. She ran her fingers over them, hesitating before she began to play. The melody was Frank's, the unfinished piece she had been working on for months, but this time it felt complete. As the notes filled the room, Richard appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, watching her with quiet admiration. "That's beautiful," he said when the last note faded. Helen looked up, her cheeks warm. "It's something Frank wrote, but I think it's finally done." Richard stepped inside, his voice gentle. "I think he'd be proud of you." Helen smiled, her heart aching with a bittersweet tenderness. "I hope so." Richard moved closer, his expression soft. "And what about you, Helen? Are you proud of yourself?" She paused, the question settling over her. For so long, she had measured her worth by what she could give, by the sacrifices she made, but now she realized she had built something lasting, not just for the children, but for herself. "I think I am," she said finally, her voice steady. "For the first time in a long time, I really am." Richard smiled, his eyes bright with something she couldn't quite name. "You deserve that." As they stood together in the quiet of the school, Helen felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. The music school was thriving, her relationships with Martha and Maggie were stronger than ever, and with Richard, she felt the beginnings of something new and unexpected. That night, as Helen walked home under a sky filled with stars, she thought of the journey she had taken, the struggles, the triumphs, the lessons learned. Life hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. And as she unlocked her front door and stepped inside, she felt a quiet certainty settle in her heart. This was just the beginning. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.